correct?
We've been locked in Earth orbit for many, many years.
We've got to get out of that Earth orbit.
This is true.
What orbit do you want to get into?
First orbit we might want to get into is going to Mars.
You want to go to Mars. How far is Mars from the projected space station?
Mars could take anywhere between 6 and 9 months to get there.
Why do you need a space station in order to go to Mars? Why don't we go directly from planet Earth to Mars?
Because it would be not responsible for the astronauts. You want to make sure that they'll be able to survive. You want to send them to Mars and bring them back safely, and there are effects on the human body that we can't even begin to understand.
Are those diminished because the astronaut departs from and returns to a space station orbiting the Earth?
It's zero gravity that's the most debilitating effect, and then there's radiation in space that could rip apart your genetic code. So we have to be able to harness those forces and make sure that we can develop countermeasures so these astronauts will be safe.
Is it fair to say that you could not get to the Mars orbit from the Earth orbit without a space station in the Earth orbit?
The space station is crucial to figure out how astronauts could live and work in space. We might be able to go direct. We might be able to go direct. We haven't figured that out.
Why do we want to get near these and so close to these other planets, including Mars?
Well, we want to do a number of things in the space program. You know, every human being looks up at the night sky, and they see those stars and they wonder, and they get to the crossover between cosmology and theology. Who am I? Where do I come from? Did life originate only on Earth? Earth and Mars started just about the same for their first roughly billion years of existence, and then life developed on Earth, and it didn't develop on Mars. What if we were to find a fossilized form of cellular life on Mars? We would begin to think differently about ourselves.
Can't we find that from robotic probes?
We are going to have robotic probes, and in fact, we are not planning on spending money on going to Mars for perhaps another 10, 15 years, but there's a window opening up in 2018. So we're going to send robots there for the next decade, and in fact...
But you want to send man there?
Ultimately. Ultimately.
You're talking about man landing on Mars?
People landing on Mars, ultimately.
As you know, Dan Goldin, administrator of NASA, and you all also know this, Hoot Gibson, because you're in the same general theater of interest and activity. There's a lot of talk about whether or not the kind of money you're looking for. You're getting $2.1 billion a year for the next 7 years, if everything goes through as planned, for the shuttle alone. And you're getting about 14, not the shuttle, but the Alpha, the space station. And then you're getting a total of about pretty close to $14 billion in the upcoming year. And you're probably going to come out of this decade with $14 billion a year, even though Norm Augustine, if I'm correct, in 1991 said that he thought that your budget coming out of this decade going into the millennium year would be $43 billion. You have enough money to do what you want to do, and what do you say to those people?
August the 20th, 1975, was a very special day for many scientists. It was the day of the Viking 1 mission to the red planet Mars. As the team of technicians settled down in front of their computers, instruments, and monitor screens, the final check of the space vehicle was taking place. Everything was ready. The countdown had begun. this costly space adventure was about to swing into action to prove once and for all that given the right conditions, life could evolve from non-living matter. The basic law of biology states that life can only come from life. Yet, now and again, some scientists suggest that perhaps life could come from non-life. In medieval times, for instance, the scientific world was convinced that vermin and flies were generated directly from rubbish dumps or garbage. In fact, the belief was so strong that in 1668, the celebrated Italian scientist Francesco Redi had to demonstrate by means of a simple experiment that vermin and flies breed in garbage, they don't come from it. He placed a piece of meat in 3 separate flasks. The first flask was covered with a piece of thin cloth, the second with a piece of paper, and the third was left open to the air. Very soon, flies started to enter the open flask and settled on the decaying meat. Although the flies couldn't enter the flask covered with the cloth, they could smell the meat and settled on top. The one covered by paper blocked in the smell and the flies ignored it. After some time, maggots appeared on the meat in the open flask. Maggots also appeared on the thin cloth covering the second flask. The decaying meat in the third flask, however, that was covered by paper, had no maggots on it. It was then obvious to all the scientists that the flies had laid their eggs on the meat in the open flask, and that these had hatched into maggots. As the flies could not get to the meat in the flask covered by the cloth, and could only smell it, they laid their eggs on the cloth. The flask covered with paper had no smell of meat, and so the flies were not attracted to it. This flask was free of maggots. 2 centuries later, however, belief by scientists in spontaneous generation was again very strong. This time, it concerned the microscopic world of bacteria and algae. They just seemed to come from nowhere. And most people believed they were generated from the matter where they were found. One of the greatest scientists of all time, Louis Pasteur, didn't share this view. He was convinced that the basic law of biology, that only life begets life, was just as good for bacteria as it was for vermin and flies and all other living things. So, before a skeptical audience, he too performed an experiment. He first took a flask, put some broth in it, which he sterilized, and sealed it. No bacteria formed on the broth. Then he used a flask with a narrow S-bend top. As the dust or particles carrying bacteria were blocked in the neck of the flask, no bacteria reached the broth. The scientific world was obliged to accept the facts. A century later, the belief has grown again that life can come from non-living matter. This time, it is believed that long, long ago, primitive life had been developed from primitive gases and chemicals. So, all eyes were fixed on Mars. The reason was that its atmosphere and climate, although extremely cold and dry, is more like Earth's than any other planet. Mars seemed to be just what was required, a sort of natural laboratory floating in space that could settle the question of whether life could evolve from non-life. There would no longer be much doubt that life evolved on Earth if traces of life could be found elsewhere. The Viking space rocket was equipped with one of the technological miracles of our day, a miniature science lab capable of performing all the experiments of a modern university laboratory, but only a cubic foot in size. This fantastic apparatus was lowered onto the Martian surface and the experiments began. It was designed to scoop up soil, analyze it with its ultra-modern instruments, and send the results back to Earth. Of one thing, the scientists felt sure. If life was not existing at present, it would have existed in the past. There were indications that surface water had once been present on Mars, and this would have created conditions similar to those that were believed to have originally existed on Earth. The excited scientists could hardly wait to process the data that was pouring into mission control. Then came the shock. It was more like an immense disappointment, probably similar to that experienced by their ancestors at the time of Louis Pasteur's experiment. They had been so sure that life could be generated from non-living matter that it was almost unbelievable to find out that the Martian soil was sterile. Not only was there no sign of life, but there was no proof that life had ever existed in the past. They checked and rechecked the data, but the story was the same. In case they had missed something, a second mission had been organized. The launch of Viking 2 on the 9th of September 1975 rekindled the hopes of some of the scientists. The new data was cold comfort. It just confirmed the truth that no life had ever existed on Mars. Of course, questions started to be asked. After all, an enormous amount of money had been spent, and the believers in evolution theory were farther away than ever from providing any sort of concrete proof for their belief. The investment had provided virtually nil returns, and taxpayers' money seemed to have been used on trying to justify a belief of a number of scientists in a theory unsupported by scientific data. Some were even saying that the results indicated that the whole notion of spontaneous generation and evolution should be abandoned. This program takes over where Viking 1 and 2 left off. Scientists are interviewed who have researched various aspects of evolutionary theory to find out what the present position really is. How old is the Earth? Is it millions of years or just a few thousand years? In 1980, Mount St. Helens, a volcano in the United States, exploded. It flattened an extensive forest and caused a tidal wave in a large local lake. Within hours, 600 feet of sediment had formed, which dried into rocks complete with strata. As a result of the explosion, huge amounts of mud flowed through the adjacent rocks and bored a canyon over 100 feet deep and 200 feet wide. Now, it has always been believed that strata in rocks and canyons take millions of years to form. But both these geological formations were formed within several hours. The other event took place in a laboratory.